If someone asks you why the American Civil War happened, you can probably give the short answer in a single breath: slavery. The North wanted it gone. The South wanted it kept. They fought. The right side won. That answer is not false. Slavery was the beating heart of the conflict, and any version of this story that tries to hide that fact has already failed. But the short answer skips the part that should actually frighten us. It skips the machinery. Because the deepest question is not simply that one half of a country enslaved 4 million human beings. The deepest question is how a nation built an entire financial system on top of those 4 million people, turn their bodies into collateral, turn that collateral into credit, turn that credit into fortune stretching from New Orleans to New York to London, and then turned all of that concentrated wealth into enough political power to gamble the survival of the republic itself. This is not a story about a moral North versus an evil South. And it is absolutely not a story about a secret cabal pulling hidden strings. It is something harder to look at. It is the story of a crime that was legal, public, profitable, insured, mortgaged, traded on international markets, and defended by respectable people who believed they were simply protecting their investments. Follow the money in the decades before 1861, and you do not find a conspiracy. You find something worse. You find a country that had made human beings into its single most valuable financial asset, and then discovered it could not let that asset go without tearing itself apart. So let's follow it carefully. Because the way this money moved tells us something the textbook version never quite manages to say. Before we go one step further, I need to set some boundaries because this subject attracts bad faith storytelling like almost no other. First, slavery is the center of everything that follows. Not a footnote, not a side issue, not one factor among many. The roughly 4 million people held in bondage in 1860 were not entries in a ledger. They were mothers and fathers, children, craftsmen, farmers, people with names and memories and an unrelenting will to be free. When we talk about their monetary value in this video, we are describing a moral horror in the language its owners used, not endorsing that language. Following the money does not make the cruelty smaller. It shows how efficiently the cruelty was organized. Second, this is not a hidden hand conspiracy. There was no single family, no secret council, and above all, no ethnic or religious group that engineered slavery or the war. That kind of claim is not history. It is prejudice wearing a costume. The people who profited from slavery were bankers, planters, merchants, insurers, shippers, and politicians of many backgrounds, acting for the oldest reasons in the world: profit, property, and power. Responsibility belongs to specific institutions and specific people who made specific choices, and we will name mechanisms, not scapegoats. Third, evidence matters. We're going to lean on primary sources: census records, bank ledgers, insurance registries, secession declarations, court rulings, and on the work of serious historians and economists who have spent careers reconstructing this system. A document tells us what people did and claimed. It does not always tell us every private motive. Where the record is uncertain, I'll say so. With those rules in place, let's start where the money starts, not with a gunshot at Fort Sumter, but with a number. Part 1, the asset. Here is the number. By 1860, the estimated market value of the enslaved people in the United States was somewhere around $3.5 billion. In the currency of that era, that figure is almost hard to comprehend. It was more than the value of all the nation's railroads combined, more than all its factories, more than all its banks. Human beings were, by a wide margin, the single largest class of capital in the entire American economy, larger than land, larger than industry, larger than every mill and locomotive and vault the country had built. Sit with that for a moment, because it reorganizes everything. When we picture antebellum wealth, we tend to imagine cotton fields and plantation houses. But the plantation house was not the asset. The land was not even the most liquid asset. The people were. A planter's net worth was measured first and foremost in the human beings he claimed to own, and those human beings could be bought, sold, moved, rented out, borrowed against, insured, and inherited with a fluidity that land never had. And they generated staggering output. Enslaved workers produced the cotton that made up somewhere around 60% of all American exports on the eve of the war. Cotton was not a regional crop, it was the country's leading export product, the thing that earned the foreign exchange that paid for imported machinery and manufactured goods, the raw material that fed the largest industry on earth, the textile mills of Britain. The economist's cold phrase for what these people were forced to be is productive capital. They were treated as machines that reproduced themselves, and after the United States banned the importation of enslaved Africans in 1808, that reproduction became the only legal way to expand the workforce. The enslaved population grew from under 1 million in 1800 to nearly 4 million by 1860, almost entirely through birth. Every child born into slavery was, in the eyes of the market, new capital appearing on a balance sheet. Once you understand that enslaved people were the country's dominant asset class, a lot of otherwise puzzling behavior snaps into focus. You start to see why Southern political leaders behaved less like regional partisans and more like the board of directors of an enormous leveraged corporation. Because in a very real financial sense, that is what they were. And an asset that valuable does not sit quietly in a field. It gets financialized. Part 2, the leverage, mortgages, and slave-backed bonds. This is the part of the story most people have never heard, and it is the part that makes the phrase human capital turn your stomach. If you own an asset worth thousands of dollars, the very first thing a sophisticated economy teaches you to do is borrow against it. And that is exactly what enslavers did. A planter could walk into a bank, pledge the human beings he claimed to own as collateral, and walk out with a loan, cash he would use to buy more land and more people, expanding the very asset he had just mortgaged. The historian Bonnie Martin, who combed through thousands of mortgage records, called this slavery's invisible engine. Her research found that across the slaveholding South, enslaved people were pledged as collateral in a huge share of all lending. In some places, human beings backed the majority of the credit in the entire local economy. People were not just labor. They were the security deposit for the Southern financial system. Now watch what happens when clever bankers get involved, because this is where it becomes shockingly modern. In Louisiana in the 1830s, institutions like the Consolidated Association of the Planters of Louisiana and the Citizens Bank of Louisiana pioneered something that will sound eerily familiar to anyone who lived through 2008. Planters mortgaged their enslaved people and their land to the bank. The bank then bundled thousands of those individual mortgages together, pooled them, and used the pool to back bonds, securities that could be sold to investors who would never set foot on a plantation. The Citizens Bank of Louisiana was capitalized at around $12 million, and that capital was built almost entirely on mortgages against enslaved people and the land they were forced to work. But investors were nervous. Human property, they noted with chilling detachment, could sicken and die. The collateral might literally perish. So the banks asked the state government to step in. And Louisiana did. The state pledged its own faith and credit to guarantee the bonds. In other words, the taxpayers of an entire state became the backstop for securities built on mortgaged human beings. To make the bonds easy to trade, they were issued in tidy denominations, $500, $1,000, roughly the price of a single enslaved person. You could buy a bond in slave-sized units without ever admitting to yourself what you were buying. And here's the international turn. These bonds did not stay in the South. The great London merchant bank Baring Brothers marketed Louisiana's slave-backed state bonds to investors across Britain, Europe, and even the American Northeast. The Rothschild banking house invested heavily in the banking systems of cotton states like Alabama. By the late 1830s, the banks of the cotton-growing states had issued tens of millions of dollars in bonds. a British widow clipping coupons in London, a merchant in Amsterdam, a financier in New York, any of them could earn a comfortable 5 or 6% return on an investment that was, at its root, a lien on the body of a person in Mississippi who had no idea they existed. Slavery had been turned into a globally traded financial product. Distance and paperwork did the moral laundering. The investor saw yield. The person saw whip. This system did exactly what over-leveraged systems always do. It inflated a bubble. Enslaved people's prices soared as credit poured in, and rising prices made the collateral look ever more valuable, which justified even more lending, which pushed prices higher still. The historian Edward Baptist has described this as a slave asset bubble, and like all bubbles, it burst. The Panic of 1837, one of the worst financial crises of the 19th century, was fueled in significant part by exactly this speculation in slave-backed credit. When cotton prices collapsed, the whole leverage tower wobbled, banks failed, and states that had guaranteed the bonds were left holding the bag. If the mechanics sound familiar, they should. Pool the mortgages, tranche the risk, sell the securities to distant investors, get the government to guarantee them, and inflate a bubble until it pops. It happened with subprime mortgages in our lifetime. It happened with mortgaged human beings 170 years earlier. And several of the banks that accepted enslaved people as collateral, the Citizens Bank and the Canal Bank of Louisiana, which between them took some 13,000 human beings as collateral and came to own more than 1,000 outright, are corporate ancestors of financial institutions still operating today. Part 3. The trade in bodies. Every one of those mortgages and bonds rested on the assumption that a human being could be reliably converted into cash. And to make that true, America built one of the largest forced migrations in human history, right inside its own borders. When Congress banned the importation of enslaved Africans in 1808, it did not weaken slavery. It reorganized it. The older slave states of the Upper South, Virginia, Maryland, had, in a grotesque phrase of the era, a surplus of enslaved people, while the exploding cotton and sugar frontier of the Deep South had an insatiable appetite for labor. And so a domestic slave trade emerged to move human beings from the one to the other. Historians estimate that roughly 1 million enslaved people were forcibly relocated from the Upper South to the Lower South between 1808 and the Civil War. Scholars call it the Second Middle Passage, and by the numbers, it was more than twice the size of the transatlantic trade that had brought Africans to what became the United States in the first place. Think about what that meant in a human life. It meant a man in Virginia could be separated from his wife and children with the stroke of a pen, chained into a coffle, a marching line of people shackled together, and walked hundreds of miles south, or shipped by sea to New Orleans, to be sold on an auction block to a stranger. It meant the phrase, sold down the river, entered the language as a synonym for the ultimate betrayal, because being sold down the Mississippi to the sugar parishes of Louisiana was very often a death sentence. Families were shattered not as an unfortunate side effect, but as a routine feature of the business model. The trade destroyed marriages and took children from parents because the market did not recognize marriages or parents. It recognized units of saleable labor, and it was enormously lucrative. As demand in the Cotton Kingdom soared, prices did not just rise, they tripled. An enslaved person who might have sold for around $500 in New Orleans in 1800 could fetch something like $1,800 by the late 1850s. The internal slave trade became, in the words of one historian, the largest enterprise in the South outside of the plantation itself, and one of the most modern, advanced in its use of transportation, credit, advertising, and finance. There were professional slave traders, franchised firms, standardized paperwork, brokers, and agents. There were newspapers whose advertising revenue depended on notices of sales and rewards for the recapture of people who had freed themselves, and entire commercials. Infrastructure existed to keep the asset liquid, to guarantee that a body pledged as collateral in one state could be seized, moved, and sold in another. The price signal that made the mortgages and bonds possible was written in the ink of separated families. Part 4. The insurance. If you can mortgage an asset and sell it, the next thing a mature financial system does is insure it. And so, of course, there was slave insurance. For a premium, an owner could take out a life insurance policy on an enslaved person, a bet, essentially, that if this human being died, the owner would be compensated for the loss of his property. These policies were especially common for enslaved people forced into dangerous work, men sent down into coal mines, laboring in turpentine camps, feeding sawmills, or crewing the steamboats that could explode without warning on the Mississippi. The riskier the work an owner forced a person into, the more that owner wanted to insure against the loss. And the companies that wrote these policies were not shadowy fly-by-night operations. They included firms whose names remain familiar. When California passed a law in 2002 requiring insurers to search their archives, several major companies, including Aetna, New York Life, and a firm that became part of the modern insurance giant AIG, found ledgers recording policies written on the lives of enslaved people. The records that survive are only a fraction of what once existed. Historians estimate the vast majority of policy records were lost over time. But even the fragments revealed a functioning market. Actuaries calculated the odds. Underwriters priced the risk. Clerks filed the paperwork. A whole apparatus of respectable financial professionals sat at desks and quietly computed the monetary consequences of a person's death for the benefit of the man who owned them. This is the quiet horror at the center of the whole story. Not screaming villains, but bookkeepers. The bureaucratization of ownership, the mortgage clerk, the bond salesman, the insurance underwriter, is what allowed enormous numbers of people to participate in an atrocity while feeling they were simply doing a respectable job. That normalization is exactly why a legalized crime can be more dangerous than a secret conspiracy. A conspiracy needs to be hidden. This didn't. It advertised. Part 5. Northern Complicity, the Lords of the Loom. Now let's demolish the most comforting piece of the whole legend, the idea that this was a Southern sin the North watched from a safe moral distance. Follow the money, and the money runs straight through the North and straight across the Atlantic. Start with a single striking estimate. Of every dollar generated by the cotton trade, something like 40 cents ended up flowing to New York City. Payment for the financing, the shipping, the insurance, and the brokerage that moved Southern cotton to market. New York did not grow cotton. New York banked it, shipped it, and insured it, and grew rich doing so. The cotton factor who advanced credit to the planter against next year's crop, the shipping firm that carried the bales, the marine insurer who covered the voyage, the merchant who imported British goods paid for by cotton receipts. These were overwhelmingly Northern businesses. The wealth of the antebellum North was not separate from slavery. It was substantially built on servicing it. There is a phrase from the era that captures this alliance perfectly. Critics described an unholy partnership between the lords of the lash, the slaveholders of the Deep South, and the lords of the loom, the textile manufacturers of New England. The mill owners of Massachusetts needed cheap cotton to keep their looms running and their fortunes growing, and cheap cotton meant driven labor. When the price of cotton rose in the market, the whip on the plantation, as one abolitionist observed, was driven all the harder. The comfort of the northern mill town and the suffering of the southern field were connected by a single price, and the circuit didn't stop at the American coastline. The largest customer for southern cotton was Great Britain, whose textile industry, centered on Manchester and the port of Liverpool, was the most advanced manufacturing sector in the world and utterly dependent on American slave-grown cotton. British banks financed the trade. British insurers covered the ships. British investors, as we've seen, bought the slave-backed bonds. The prosperity of industrial Britain, the workshop of the world, was interwoven with the plantations of Alabama and Mississippi. This was not a regional economy. It was a transatlantic system, and the profits were shared by respectable institutions on two continents who mostly preferred not to look too closely at the source. This is why we have to be honest about complicity without collapsing into the false claim that everyone was equally guilty, so no one was. That's a dodge, and it's wrong. The Confederacy was founded explicitly to protect slavery. The North, whatever its entanglements, became the force that destroyed it. But a fair accounting refuses to let the North play the innocent bystander. The bystander was cashing the checks. Part 6. The politics of a threatened asset. Now we can finally understand the politics. because the politics only make sense once you see them as the defense of an asset. Here is the crucial thing about that $3.5 billion asset. Its value depended on the ability to expand. Cotton agriculture exhausted the soil. Planters constantly needed fresh land to the west, which meant slavery had to be allowed to spread into the new territories. But it was more than soil. The value of enslaved people was propped up by confidence that the whole system had a future, that the political and legal order would keep protecting it, keep enforcing it, keep letting it grow. Anything that signaled the containment of slavery, hemming it into the existing states with no room to expand, was, to a slaveholder, not an abstract moral rebuke. It was a threat to the market value of his single largest holding. Contain the asset, and its price would eventually collapse. That is why every political battle of the antebellum decades was, underneath the constitutional language, a fight over the future price of human beings. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 drew a line across the map dividing future free territory from future slave territory, an attempt to manage the expansion of the asset. The Wilmot Proviso of 1846 tried to bar slavery from any land taken in the war with Mexico, and Southern leaders reacted as if to an existential attack, because they understood the financial logic exactly. The Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 that reopened the question and drenched Kansas in blood, each was a skirmish in a long war over whether the most valuable asset class in America would be allowed to grow. And then came the courtroom. In 1857, in the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court delivered what amounted to a total victory for the asset holders. The court ruled that black people were not and could not be citizens, and, more explosively, that Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories at all, striking down the Missouri Compromise. In financial terms, the highest court in the land had just ruled that the slaveholder's asset was constitutionally protected property that could travel anywhere in the Union. It was as if the court had guaranteed the value of the portfolio nationwide. For slaveholders, it was a triumph. For millions of others, it was proof that the slave power now controlled the federal government itself. That phrase, the slave power, points to a structural advantage baked into the Constitution from the beginning. The 3/5 clause counted enslaved people who had no rights whatsoever as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of allocating seats in Congress and votes in the Electoral College. The result was that the enslavers got extra political representation in proportion to the number of people they held in bondage. The more human beings you owned as property, the more political power you were granted over the nation. For decades, this handed slaveholding states a disproportionate grip on the presidency, the Congress, and the courts. The asset didn't just generate money, it generated votes. So when a new political party, the Republicans, rose in the 1850s on a platform not of abolishing slavery where it existed, but simply of stopping its expansion, of containing it, slaveholders heard the death knell of their portfolio. And when that party's candidate, Abraham Lincoln, won the presidency in 1860 without carrying a single Southern state, the largest holders of the largest asset class in America concluded that the political order, which protected their wealth, had finally slipped from their grasp. Part 7. King Cotton and the Hubris of 1857. There's one more piece of financial psychology we need because it explains the recklessness of what came next. In 1857, another financial panic swept the country, but this one behaved differently from 1837. The Panic of 1857 hammered the industrializing North, its banks, its railroads, its factories, while the Cotton South rode through it comparatively unharmed because European demand for cotton held firm. To Southern leaders, the lesson seemed obvious and intoxicating. The North's economy was fragile and speculative. The South's, resting on cotton and slavery, was the true foundation of national wealth. Cotton, they concluded, was king. In 1858, a South Carolina senator gave a speech that distilled this confidence into a dare. Cotton was so essential to the world economy, he argued, that no power on earth would risk war against it. If the South withheld its cotton, Britain would collapse, the civilized world would starve, and everyone would come begging. "You dare not make war upon cotton," he told the North. "Cotton is king." It was economic hubris raised to the level of foreign policy. Southern leaders came to believe their asset made them invulnerable. that Britain's dependence on cotton would force it to break any northern blockade and recognize a Confederate nation, that King Cotton would win their independence for them without their having to earn it. This belief was catastrophically wrong. Britain had stockpiled cotton, would find new sources in Egypt and India, and would ultimately decline to go to war to defend slavery. But the belief mattered enormously because it made secession feel not like a desperate gamble, but like a sound business decision. The men steering the southern states toward disunion did so partly because they had convinced themselves the numbers were on their side. Part 8. Secession and war as a financial decision. And so we arrive at secession. And here, we do not have to guess at motives because the men who led the South out of the Union told us, in writing, exactly why they were doing it. When we read the secession declarations that several states issued to justify leaving, the language is not primarily about tariffs, and it is not primarily about an abstract theory of states' rights. It is about slavery, stated openly and repeatedly. Mississippi's declaration announced that its position was thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world, and that a blow at slavery was a blow at commerce and civilization. South Carolina's grievance was that the free states had failed to uphold the enforcement of slavery and had elected a president hostile to it. These were not coded documents. They were frank about defending an economic and social order built on human property. The states' right they were most anxious to protect was the right to hold, sell, and expand slavery. Seen through the financial lens, secession was the boardroom deciding that the political environment had become too hostile to the corporation's core asset and choosing to walk out and found a new nation explicitly organized to protect it. The Confederacy's own vice president would soon declare that the new government rested as its cornerstone on the institution of slavery. They were not shy. They built a country on it. And then they had to pay for a war, which exposed immediately the strange fragility of their wealth. The Confederacy was asset-rich and cash-poor. Its enormous wealth was locked up in enslaved people and in cotton, neither of which could be easily turned into the guns, ships, and railroads a modern war required. So the Confederate government did the only thing it could. It tried to borrow against cotton. In 1863, it floated what became known as the Erlanger Loan, arranged through a Paris banking house in which European investors bought Confederate bonds that were, in effect, backed by the promise of future cotton deliveries. For a while, speculators in London and Paris gambled on Southern victory by buying paper secured with a crop grown by enslaved people. When the Confederacy's military fortunes collapsed, so did the bonds, and European investors who had bet on slavery's survival lost their money. The asset that had made the South feel invincible turned out to be nearly impossible to spend. Part 9. Emancipation as expropriation. Now consider what the end of the war actually did in financial terms, because it is one of the most extraordinary economic events in the history of the modern world. When slavery was abolished, $3.5 billion of what had legally been the country's largest asset class simply ceased to exist as property. Overnight, on paper, the wealthiest slaveholders in the South went from being among the richest men on the continent to holding worthless titles to people who were now free. It was, by dollar value, the single largest confiscation of property in American history. A destruction of wealth so vast, it is difficult to find a comparison. The entire leveraged edifice we've been describing, the mortgages, the bonds, the insurance policies, the collateral, evaporated at its foundation because you cannot mortgage a free human being. But here is the moral heart of it, the thing that must never be lost. The people who had been that property received nothing, not wages for generations of stolen labor, not land, not compensation. The wealth they had created with their bodies over 2.5 centuries was not transferred to them. It was simply extinguished as a legal category. Compare this with how the British Empire had ended slavery in its colonies 3 decades earlier. Britain paid an immense sum, £20 million, an enormous fraction of the national budget, in compensation. But that money went to the slave owners for the loss of their human property. Not one penny went to the people who had been enslaved. In the United States, the federal government did briefly experiment with compensating owners in the District of Columbia, again paying the enslavers, not the enslaved. The pattern of who counted as a party owed money and who counted only as the property in question tells you everything about whose humanity the financial system had ever recognized. So freedom came without capital. 4 million people emerged from bondage into a society that had just lost the war, fought to keep them enslaved, owning nothing, owed nothing, and surrounded by former enslavers desperate to reconstruct as much of the old order as the law would still allow. The asset was gone. The debt owed to the people who had been the asset was never paid. Part 10. The Human Ledger. We've spent a long time inside the language of finance, collateral, yield, liquidity, asset class, and that language does something dangerous if we're not careful. It lets us see human beings the way the bankers saw them, so before we close, we have to deliberately step outside the ledger because the ledger is precisely what we are indicting. The people in these records were not passive collateral. Across every decade of this system, enslaved people resisted it through escape, through sabotage, through the daily refusal to be reduced to the thing the market said they were, through preserving families and faith and memory against a machine designed to shatter all three. The Underground Railroad was, among other things, a direct assault on the value of the asset. Every person who freed themselves was a hole in someone's balance sheet, which is exactly why slaveholders demanded ever more brutal fugitive recapture laws. Self-emancipation was economic warfare that the enslaved waged with their own feet. And when the war came, formerly enslaved people did not wait to be liberated. They liberated themselves and then turned around and helped win the war. Around 180,000 black men served in the United States Army, with tens of thousands more in the Navy. The very people the Confederacy had counted as property took up arms and became a decisive force in destroying the system that had claimed to own them. Every one of those soldiers was a line item that had walked off the ledger and picked up a rifle. The people the market had tried to render silent turned out to be authors of their own emancipation. The staggering price of it all is worth stating plainly. Something on the order of 620,000 people died in the war, and some modern demographic studies push that figure considerably higher. Whatever the exact number, it means that untangling the country from its most valuable asset cost more American lives than any conflict before or since. That is what it took to dislodge wealth once it had rooted itself in human bondage. Moral argument alone, for decades, had not been enough. Part 11. Why this still matters. So why does any of this matter now beyond the grim satisfaction of a fuller history? It matters first because the money did not disappear when slavery did. The fortunes built on enslaved labor and the trade that serviced it were passed down, reinvested, and compounded across generations into banks, universities, insurance companies, railroads, and family estates that still exist. When institutions like major banks and insurers acknowledge, as several have, that their corporate ancestors accepted enslaved people as collateral or wrote policies on their lives, they are admitting that the plumbing of the modern American economy runs partly through this history. And the flip side is just as real. The people who were denied capital at emancipation and then denied it again through generations of exclusion that followed began a long race from a starting line set decades behind everyone else. Not every disparity in American life today traces to a single cause in the 19th century, but you cannot understand the present distribution of wealth by pretending it began from zero. It matters second as a warning about how systems corrupt the people inside them. The most unsettling fact in this entire story is not that a few monsters did terrible things. It is that enormous numbers of ordinary, respectable people, clerks, brokers, underwriters, investors, politicians, participated in an atrocity while believing they were simply being prudent, doing their jobs, protecting their family's security, honoring their contracts. The system made cruelty look like commerce. It converted a moral catastrophe into paperwork, and paperwork is easy to sign. That is the mechanism to fear. Not the secret room, but the open office where terrible things are made routine. And it matters as a lesson about the relationship between money and power that reaches far beyond 1861. Whenever a society allows enormous wealth to concentrate around a single interest and lets that interest capture the courts, the legislature, and the language of rights, it becomes very hard to reform that interest peacefully because the people who profit from it will fight reform not as a moral debate, but as an attack on their property. The antebellum slaveholders were not irrational. Within the logic of their balance sheets, secession was almost coherent. That is the danger. Rational self-interest, scaled up and armed with political power, can march a nation straight off a cliff, while every participant insists he is only protecting what is rightfully his. So the next time you hear that the Civil War was just about states' rights, ask which right, specifically those states were so determined to defend, and follow that right until you arrive, as you always will, at the ownership of human beings. When you hear that it was really about tariffs and economics, not slavery, remember that the economics were slavery. The mortgages, the bonds, the insurance, the cotton, the 40 cents on every dollar, all of it rested on people who were bought and sold. And when someone tries to tell you that a secret cabal engineered the whole thing from the shadows, remember that the truth is both simpler and more disturbing. There was no cabal. There was a public, legal, insured, mortgaged, internationally traded market in human beings, defended in open daylight by people who thought of themselves as respectable. Following the money in this story does not make the horror smaller. It shows you the machine that manufactured the horror and made it profitable, and it shows you how many hands turned the gears while looking away. The Civil War was, at its center, a moral reckoning with slavery, but it was also the violent, unavoidable collision that comes when a nation builds its greatest fortune on an injustice, and then discovers it cannot give the fortune back without breaking itself in two. That is the question worth carrying out of this history. Not only why the war happened, but what systems we live inside right now, where the profit is clear and visible and the price someone else is paying has simply been moved somewhere we've all agreed not to look. If this changed the way you understand the Civil War, subscribe, because this is what we do here. We follow the money behind the headlines of history until the real machinery comes into view. Leave a comment and tell me, which part surprised you most? The slave-backed bonds, the insurance policies, the northern banks, or the sheer scale of that $3.5 billion number? And if you found this valuable, share it, so more people can see the history beneath the history. I'll see you in the next investigation.